What if going to prison in the 1800s didn't just mean losing your freedom? It meant losing your sanity, your health, and sometimes even your life. Today, prisons are heavily regulated institutions. But in the 1800s, stepping inside a prison could mean entering a world of brutal silence, forced labor, disease, and psychological torture. And in this video, I'm going to recreate many of these 1800s prison scenes using AI. So you can actually see what these places looked like and feel what prisoners experienced inside those stone walls. Because halfway through this video, you'll discover a prison system so psychologically devastating that inmates literally went insane. And by the end, you'll understand why historians say some prisons in the 1800s were worse than medieval dungeons. Before the 1800s, prisons were not designed the way we think of them today. They were rarely meant to hold people for long periods of time. Instead, they functioned mainly as temporary holding places for individuals who were waiting for their actual punishment. If someone was accused of a crime in the 17th or 18th century, they were usually locked up only until a judge decided their fate. After that, the punishment often happened quickly and publicly. Justice during this period focused more on deterrence and public spectacle than on long-term imprisonment. Common punishments included public whipping, branding with hot irons, time in the stocks, transportation to distant colonies, or execution. In many parts of the British Empire, thousands of convicted criminals were sent overseas to colonies such as Australia, where they were forced to work as laborers. Because prisons were only temporary holding spaces, governments rarely invested much money into them. Conditions inside these early jails, often called jails, were typically filthy and chaotic. Prisoners of all kinds were thrown together in the same rooms: men, women, children, debtors, and violent criminals. There were usually no proper beds, little ventilation, and almost no sanitation. Disease spread easily in these overcrowded spaces, and many prisoners depended on their families to bring them food because the jail itself provided very little. But by the late 1700s, a growing number of reformers began arguing that punishment should be handled differently. Instead of relying only on public violence or execution, they believed criminals could potentially be reformed and rehabilitated through discipline, work, and reflection. This new idea led to the development of something that had never existed before on a large scale: the modern prison system. The goal was to create institutions where criminals would serve long sentences while being transformed into law-abiding citizens. But as these new prison systems began spreading in the early 1800s, something unexpected happened. Many of these so-called reforms ended up creating prison environments that were far harsher and far more psychologically damaging than anything that came before. As the idea of long-term imprisonment began spreading in the early 1800s, prison reformers started experimenting with different systems they believed could transform criminals into disciplined, moral citizens. One of the most influential of these models became known as the silent system. This system was first developed in the United States, most famously at Auburn Prison in New York during the 1820s. The philosophy behind it seemed straightforward. Prisoners would spend their days working together in prison workshops, but they were strictly forbidden from speaking. Not a word. Prisoners were not allowed to talk to each other, whisper, or even make unnecessary sounds. Guards enforced the silence constantly, and anyone who broke the rule faced immediate punishment. Discipline inside these prisons was extremely strict. Inmates marched everywhere in lockstep formation, walking in single file with their eyes lowered and their hands resting on the shoulders of the prisoner in front of them. This method allowed guards to control large groups of prisoners while preventing them from communicating. At night, each prisoner returned to a small individual cell. During the day, they performed hard labor in workshops producing goods such as furniture, clothing, or tools. To prison officials, the system appeared highly successful. Visitors often described the prisons as orderly, quiet, and efficient. The silence itself was meant to symbolize discipline and obedience, but maintaining that silence required constant force. If a prisoner spoke or disobeyed an order, guards could respond with severe punishments. Whippings were common. Some prisoners were beaten in front of others as a warning. Others were placed in isolation cells or given reduced food rations. For many inmates, the constant pressure of living in total silence created intense psychological stress. Human beings are naturally social, and the complete prohibition of communication turned daily life into a controlled environment where even the smallest mistake could lead to punishment. Despite these harsh conditions, many reformers still believed the silent system was too lenient. They argued that prisoners were still being exposed to the influence of other criminals during work hours. So in the late 1820s, another prison experiment began to emerge, one that would take isolation even further. Instead of forcing prisoners to remain silent around others, some reformers decided prisoners should never see each other at all. In 1829, a new and far more radical prison experiment began in Philadelphia with the opening of Eastern State Penitentiary. Unlike prisons that use the silent system, this institution was built around a completely different philosophy: total isolation. This approach became known as the Pennsylvania system, and its goal was to force prisoners into deep reflection about their crimes. Reformers believed that if criminals were separated from other prisoners and left alone with their thoughts, they would eventually feel remorse and transform into better people. So every prisoner was placed in a single, isolated cell. They slept alone, they ate alone, they worked alone, and they never saw other inmates. Each cell was designed to function as a complete environment where a prisoner could spend nearly every moment of the day. Prisoners performed small tasks like weaving or crafting items inside their cells, and guards delivered food through small openings in the doors. Even when prisoners were occasionally allowed outside their cells, strict precautions were taken to prevent contact with others. Guards placed hoods over prisoners' heads when they were moved through the corridors, so they could not see or recognize other inmates. At first, many reformers believed this system represented the most humane prison design ever created. It eliminated violence between prisoners and replaced physical punishment with quiet reflection. But very quickly, disturbing consequences began to appear. Human beings are not designed to live in complete isolation for long periods of time. Within just a few years, prison officials began reporting that many inmates were showing severe psychological symptoms. Some prisoners fell into deep depression. Others experienced hallucinations or extreme anxiety. In some cases, prisoners stopped speaking entirely, even when guards addressed them. A number of inmates suffered complete mental breakdowns. What was supposed to be a system of moral reflection had turned into something far darker, a form of punishment that attacked the human mind itself. And when visitors from around the world came to see this new prison experiment, some of them left deeply disturbed by what they witnessed. One of those visitors was a famous writer whose reaction would soon spark international debate about solitary confinement. In 1842, the famous British novelist Charles Dickens visited the United States during a tour of American institutions and social systems. During this trip, he was given the opportunity to visit Eastern State Penitentiary, which at the time was considered one of the most advanced prisons in the world. Many reformers proudly showed the prison to visitors as an example of humanitarian progress. At first glance, the facility seemed impressive. The prison was carefully designed with long corridors extending from a central hub, allowing guards to monitor multiple cell blocks. Each prisoner had their own cell, a small exercise yard, and access to basic work materials. Compared to the overcrowded jails of the previous century, it appeared far more organized and controlled. But as Dickens spent more time observing the prisoners, his opinion changed dramatically. He realized that behind the quiet order of the prison was something deeply disturbing. The prisoners lived in almost complete social isolation, sometimes for years at a time. They rarely spoke to anyone and had virtually no human contact beyond brief interactions with guards. Dickens later described the system as a form of punishment that slowly destroyed the mind. He argued that while physical torture was visible and immediate, prolonged isolation attacked a person in a much more hidden and devastating way. In his writings about the prison, Dickens warned that this kind of punishment could cause permanent psychological damage. He believed the suffering caused by extreme solitude was far worse than authorities realized. Despite his criticism, however, the idea of solitary confinement did not disappear. In fact, many prisons across the United States and Europe continued experimenting with different systems of isolation and strict discipline, but mental suffering was only one part of life inside these institutions. For most prisoners, daily life also meant exhausting labor and relentless physical discipline. Life inside many 19th century prisons revolved around one central idea: hard labor. Prison reformers believed that strict routines and physically demanding work would teach prisoners discipline, obedience, and moral responsibility. As a result, inmates were often forced to perform exhausting labor for many hours every day. In some prisons, prisoners worked in workshops producing goods such as shoes, furniture, nails, or textiles. These products could then be sold outside the prison, making the institution partially self-sustaining. But not all prison labor was meant to produce useful items. In fact, some of the most infamous prison tasks were designed purely to punish and exhaust inmates. One of the most notorious examples was the penal treadmill, introduced in British prisons in 1818 by engineer William Cubitt. The device looked like a massive rotating staircase. Prisoners were forced to step continuously on moving wooden slats while holding onto a railing above them. As the wheel rotated, prisoners had to keep climbing step after step just to stay in place. In many prisons, inmates were required to walk on these machines for several hours a day, sometimes totaling thousands of steps. Guards carefully monitored their pace to make sure they did not slow down or stop. In some cases, the treadmill powered equipment like mills for grinding grain or pumping water. But in many prisons, the machines served no practical purpose at all. Their real function was simply to exhaust prisoners physically and mentally. Other forms of punishment labor were equally brutal. Some prisoners were ordered to break large stones into gravel, while others operated heavy crank machines that required constant turning. These crank devices were particularly cruel. Prisoners might be forced to rotate a handle thousands of times each day, often without knowing whether the effort was actually connected to any machinery. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and deliberately monotonous. Guards enforced strict discipline throughout the day. If prisoners slowed down, refused orders, or attempted to communicate with others, they could face additional punishment. This combination of relentless labor, strict silence, and constant surveillance created an environment where prisoners lived under continuous physical and psychological pressure. Yet even these harsh working conditions were not the greatest danger inside many 1800s prisons. For thousands of inmates, the most deadly threat came from something far less visible: disease. While prison labor and strict discipline defined daily life in many 19th century prisons, the greatest danger often came from something prisoners could not control at all: disease. Prisons during the 1800s were frequently overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary. In many institutions, hundreds of prisoners were confined in spaces that had been designed to hold far fewer people. Fresh air was limited, cells were damp and dark. Waste disposal systems were primitive or completely absent. These conditions created the perfect environment for infectious diseases to spread rapidly. One of the most feared illnesses in prisons during this time was tuberculosis, which spreads easily in confined spaces where ventilation is poor. Prisoners living in close quarters often infected each other, and once the disease took hold inside a prison, it could spread quickly through the entire population. Other deadly illnesses were also common, including cholera and typhus. These diseases thrived in environments where sanitation was limited and clean water was difficult to maintain. Food inside many prisons was also extremely basic and often nutritionally inadequate. Typical meals might consist of small portions of bread, thin soup, or a simple porridge known as gruel. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and protein were rarely available, leaving many prisoners malnourished. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making prisoners even more vulnerable to disease. Medical care inside prisons was also limited. Some prisons had doctors, but treatment options during the 1800s were far less advanced than today. Once serious illness began spreading, prison authorities often struggled to control outbreaks. Historical records show that in certain institutions, death rates were shockingly high. In some cases, prisoners had a higher chance of dying inside prison than they would have had outside of it. Over time, reports of these conditions began reaching the public. Journalists, reformers, and medical experts started investigating what was happening behind prison walls. Their findings sparked growing criticism of the prison system. By the late 19th century, pressure for change was becoming impossible to ignore. By the second half of the 19th century, growing criticism of prison conditions began forcing governments to re-examine how these institutions operated. Reports from doctors, journalists, and prison inspectors revealed disturbing details about life inside many prisons. Investigations described overcrowded cells, poor sanitation, widespread disease, and the severe psychological effects of extreme isolation. Medical experts increasingly warned that long periods of solitary confinement could cause serious mental damage. Some prisoners developed depression, anxiety, or hallucinations after spending months or even years without meaningful human contact. These concerns slowly began influencing public opinion. In Britain, government investigations such as the Gladstone Committee report examined the state of the prison system and recommended major reforms. The report argued that prisons should focus less on pure punishment and more on rehabilitation. Around the same time, reform movements in the United States also began pushing for improvements inside prisons. Critics argued that extremely harsh discipline and total isolation were not actually reforming criminals. Instead, they were often leaving prisoners physically weakened and mentally damaged. Gradually, some prison systems started introducing changes. Reforms included improving sanitation and ventilation, providing better food for prisoners, limiting the use of prolonged solitary confinement, expanding access to education and religious instruction, creating structured work programs that served practical purposes. These reforms did not immediately transform prisons into humane environments, but they marked the beginning of a shift in how incarceration was understood. Prisons were no longer seen only as places of punishment. More reformers began arguing that they should also prepare prisoners to eventually return to society. However, not every practice from the 1800s disappeared. In fact, one of the most controversial punishments developed during that era still exists in modern prisons today. Although many prison reforms were introduced by the late 19th century, one practice from that era never completely disappeared. Solitary confinement. Even today, prisons around the world still use isolation as a disciplinary measure. In some systems, inmates can spend weeks, months, or even years separated from the general prison population. When historians study 19th century prisons today, they often reach the same conclusion. The institutions meant to represent progress and reform sometimes created conditions that were far harsher than the punishments they were meant to replace. For thousands of prisoners living behind those stone walls, survival itself became the greatest challenge. And the story of these prisons serves as a powerful reminder of how difficult it has always been to balance justice, punishment, and humanity.